Story 1. We did not know how many more planes might be headed for disaster. During that first hour or two, we did not know whether it was 4 or 40. Story 2. Personally, my classmate was screaming and crying, "My dad works in those buildings." Story 3. When the second plane hit, you realized it wasn't just an accident. You could feel the whole world shift. Story 4. People trapped above the impact zone chose to jump rather than suffocate or burn. Story 5. The unknown hung over us. I was only a teenager, and nobody knew whether there would be another attack or where it would occur. We did not even know whether the first incident had been an attack or an accident. Story 6. The next day, when the train station parking lot still had all the cars, we knew the town had lost several people. Story 7. Watching a man decide to jump from a great height because he knew the tower was about to fall was broadcast live. The image has never left me. It was a horrific day from the start and remains so even now. Story 8. Worst is subjective. When the second tower was hit, it was an immediate sinking feeling that I had never experienced before or since, and it was amplified by the fact that everyone around made the same immediate realization that this was not an accident. When people started jumping, that was bad. You assumed the worst had happened. But then people were working to get it under control and you thought the worst was over. That was a terrible moment to suddenly realize the worst was far from over. Above the fire, the people who died instantly might have been the lucky ones. When the first tower fell, that was the most surreal moment of my life. It was a profound moment of derealization. You felt lifted from your usual state of reality and observed it from a distance. Imagine seeing something so unexpected that you seriously questioned whether you were dreaming while wide awake. Again, it was not something most people expected. They had stood up to direct collisions with planes. No layperson expected them to fall. After that day, the worst part was the posters of missing persons everywhere. They remained for weeks and months at subway stations and other public places, and after a couple of days, everyone understood that none of them would be seen again. Story 9. The most shocking moment shown that day was when the towers fell. Story 10. I was not able to contact my friend who worked in Tower 1 for a few days. Luckily, she was late for work that day because she stopped for a latte. She was caught in the toxic debris, but she has been healthy ever since. Thank God. Story 11. I was in my 30s. I watched the entire event on television from about 10 minutes before the second plane struck through to the following morning. There was no single worst memory. It was a long period of one horror after another. The memories that haunt me most are: 1. The collective realization that it was not an accident. 2. A description given to a reporter by a member of the public of a couple who had been hit by flying debris as they walked past the World Trade Center. They had been embracing and had been sliced through by sheet metal. 3. The sheer number of people who jumped. People now seem to think it was a handful. It was not. It was hundreds. People were falling from the buildings, often in clusters, many holding hands. The world has changed since then, and not for the better. It was a turning point in humanity. Story 12. The sound of dozens of personal alert safety system alarms sounding for firefighters crushed under the wreckage. Story 13. I was in Manhattan on September 11th. For me and most people in the office, before anyone started to leave, it was about realizing what had happened. We did not know right away. Everyone thought it was a small plane that had lost its way and struck one of the towers. There were no social media platforms or camera phones, and information was not as instantaneous as it is today. One part of the September 11th story that has been lost to history is that when the first tower fell, it was so loud that if you were not near Lower Manhattan, people thought it was a third plane. Story 14. The jumpers and the people trapped above the impact zone. Story 15. There was no single worst moment. It was a series of terrible moments, one after another. The first plane hit. At first people thought it was a terrible pilot. The second plane hit. That made it clear it was no accident. The Pentagon was hit. People wondered what would happen next. A plane went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. How many more attacks would there be? Then people saw people jumping from the towers. One tower collapsed while we watched live. How many people had I just watched die? The second tower collapsed. It was incomprehensible. The skyline of my city changed forever. How many workers in the towers died? What about the firefighters? What about the New York Police Department? He is widely criticized now, but Mayor Giuliani showed strength and calm for the city when it seemed like everything was ending. Television replayed the towers being hit and collapsing repeatedly. There was no single defining moment. The entire day and the days and months that followed were nightmares. Story 16. I worked in Midtown. When we first heard that a plane had hit a tower, we assumed pilot error. It was a clear blue sky that morning. Then, when news of a second plane arrived, we immediately realized it was a terrorist attack. Remember, the World Trade Center had been attacked before, and it had always been a favorite target. Then we got news about the Pentagon, and at that moment we realized we were at war. That was terrifying. But the worst part for me was watching the towers on fire. None of us had any idea how firefighters were going to stop a huge fire that high up. We imagined seeing the towers with large chunks missing for a while, like the Oklahoma City building. Then World Trade Center Tower 2 started to tumble down. I honestly had not considered that possibility. It was the first and only time I had my hand over my mouth in horror. Just the thought of all those people still in the building and those on the street was unbearable. I thought maybe World Trade Center Tower 1 would still stand, but when it collapsed as well, it was still indescribably horrifying. The weeks afterward were utterly depressing. You could not walk anywhere around Manhattan without seeing flyers of missing loved ones everywhere. Story 17. For me, it was walking through the blood and bones of Manhattan to try to find my brother. Story 18. My sister was missing for about 2 hours. She was fine. Story 19. I was 10 and lived in Brooklyn across the bridge, which is not that far as the crow flies. Later I learned that the technology teacher videotaped the second plane hitting the tower from the school roof, that burned papers from the tower fell into my backyard, that a close family friend missed being in the tower by an hour, and that a classmate's father, a firefighter, died in the towers. On the day itself, I mostly remember how strange the adults were acting. My school handled it well. We were told in a small group that parents would be picking up children, but that did not mean we were unsafe. I did not understand why the teachers were so scared. Did people not die every day? I did not think I understood how close it was, or my brain was trying not to think about it. One moment that is funny in retrospect. A classmate said, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," in the voice from the show. A teacher flipped out and seemed so disturbed that I found it worrying. I told her it was from South Park, and she calmed down. The kid looked shell-shocked. I think the teacher genuinely believed her student was a sociopath making fun of people who had lost someone, instead of recognizing he was a 10-year-old who had been making the same joke every day for months. Story 20. My answer may sound a little weird. I had been watching the news most of the day, but each day at 5 p.m. my college friends and I would put on reruns of The Simpsons, which ran in syndication on the local Fox station. That day we switched over at 5 p.m., and of course it was just more news. For some reason, that was when it really hit me how much things were going to change. Story 21. I had flown on Flight 11 a few weeks earlier. It was an everyday flight. It was reported that the terrorists had made several dry runs across the country. I have never been able to find out if there was one on my flight. To this day, I get a sick feeling in my stomach when I think about it. Story 22. Silence filled the air after all the planes had stopped. People stood on highway overpasses, staring at buildings burning or collapsed. Cars remained at the train station, their owners never returning. Story 23. I felt terror at not being able to get a hold of my dad that day. All I knew was that he was supposed to be at the Pentagon that week. Close behind that was seeing the second plane hit live on television and the realization that the first one was not a freak accident. Story 24. When the second plane hit, you knew this was not an accident and that the world order would be forever changed. Story 25. I realized the little drops peeling away from the smoking part of the building were people. I tried to imagine how I would make that choice. Die from smoke inhalation and fire, be pancaked by the floors above, or jump to avoid the other two. I saw a couple of coworkers holding hands as they fell, and a woman trying to hold her dress down as the wind pushed it up. Story 26. I was very young at the time. All I remember is my mother crying hysterically at the television. This was in the United Kingdom as well. Story 27. When I was 7 years old, I saw my mother late at night open an atlas to find Afghanistan on the map. I also believed the whole world was going to burn. Story 28. I was 17 at the time. Watching people run from collapsing buildings was horrifying. Seeing the second plane hit and people jumping to their deaths felt surreal. I hate this world. Story 29. I was in first grade in northern New Jersey. We did not really know what was going on, but we knew something was not right. Parents stood outside singing America the Beautiful as they unexpectedly picked us up at lunchtime. That seemed even weirder to our 6-year-old minds because half-days were fun. But the parents looked sad and there were no play dates. The worst moment was the next morning, when a couple of children did not come to school because their dads did not make it home from work the night before. Story 30. My neighbors in Providence, Rhode Island, sacked a bodega down the street and smashed its windows because they thought the Indian who owned it was a Muslim. Story 31. I will always remember the beeping. When the firefighters were searching for survivors, thousands of locator devices were beeping so rescuers could find bodies. Outside of watching people fall to their deaths, the beeping haunts me most. It went on for weeks while television repeatedly covered Ground Zero, even on Spanish-language channels. The beeping felt endless. Each beep marked a person: a father, mother, son, daughter, aunt, uncle. Other horrors were when the planes stopped flying overhead, which was the most eerie feeling, and learning that rescuers sometimes pretended to be trapped so the search dogs would not become too depressed to stop looking for survivors. Story 32. My mother was in the Pentagon. The worst part was not knowing if she was okay. She was okay. What I saw on the television in my high school Spanish class was indeed her office, but she was in a different part of the building when the plane hit. She was actually on her way to brief General Maud, who died that day. I believe he still holds the distinguished honor of being the highest-ranking soldier to die during an enemy action. I met him once. He was a good man. Story 33. Everything changed after that. We have not been the same since. Story 34. The second plane hit, and people knew what was taking place but did not know how many planes were still out there. Story 35. When Donald Trump went on television, he said he was happy that he now owned the tallest building in New York. Story 36. My dad was working in Manhattan, and I was waiting for him to come home. Story 37. For me, not knowing if my parents were alive or dead. My parents were overseas, flying back to the United States that day on an American Airlines flight into John F. Kennedy International Airport, landing around the time the first tower was struck. I was a freshman at the time, and our school had more than 2,300 students, so it was very uncommon to see the principal instead of the vice principal. The principal pulled me out of class and explained the situation. All I could think about was how I was going to take care of my little brother, where we would need to move to because our extended family did not live close, and how to plan a funeral. I sat in the principal's office watching the news to see if we could get any indication of what was happening. Then the second tower was hit. I tried to keep calm on the outside, but my teenage brain was full of what-if scenarios. A few hours later, my parents were able to call the school to say they were okay. They had to divert to a different airport and keep everyone on the plane until the situation was better understood. They told me they could see smoke from the first tower before they diverted. I will never forget that day, both from a historical and a personal standpoint. Story 38. All of it. Realizing it wasn't an accident. Watching people fall or jump. Not knowing where your friends and family were. Story 39. I was at work without a television, so I was just listening to the radio reports. Someone had a small television in her office and many people crowded into her office to watch. I stopped by for a few minutes and saw the two buildings on fire. The camera angles from the helicopters looked strange. I said that one of the buildings was leaning far too much and looked like it could fall. About 10 minutes later it did, but I did not see it live. The oh my god moment for me was when they announced that the Pentagon had been hit and another plane was missing. Fighter jets had been scrambled to locate the missing plane. They announced that clearly multiple times on the radio. I will always wonder whether they really did shoot it down. Story 40. After the airplanes were grounded, I heard a jet that sounded very close overhead. My first thought was that it was headed directly for my condominium. I lived 20 minutes south of Cleveland, near the airspace where Flight 93 turned and headed back east before eventually crashing in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Story 41. Shortly after the second tower was hit, everyone in my office gathered around the conference room monitors and watched the broadcast. When the report of the crash in Pennsylvania aired, a former coworker lost it. She yelled, "Where are our missiles?" and loudly declared that the United States military should immediately shoot every remaining commercial flight out of the sky, while no one attempted to calm her. At that moment, it felt as if our social order could collapse. Story 42. I was a sophomore in high school. For weeks after the towers fell, 24 hours a day, every network and cable news channel replayed the footage of the second plane hitting and the towers collapsing. You could not escape it. That led to a wave of ultra-patriotism that never went away, and two wars presented with slick graphics and theme music. Our peers came home either mentally or physically broken, if they were lucky, or in a body bag if they were not. And people wonder why my generation has such dark humor and drank too much. Story 43. I was listening to the radio at work. When the second plane hit, I realized it was an attack. The news showed people jumping, but I could not watch that. Story 44. Yes, the second tower. I knew in that moment that whatever came next, we would never be the same. This was the first time the United States was completely vulnerable. World War I and World War II did not physically affect us. Both bordering countries were our friends and allies, and two oceans cushioned us from impact. But September 11th, 2001 taught us that we could still be hit and hit hard. While we were never as kind to immigrants as we should have been, we began to fear immigrants. Fear can be exploited, and it has. Story 45. When I first heard a plane hit, I thought it was a small one, like the incident with the Empire State Building years ago. Then I turned on the television and my heart sank. I was devastated. I grew up in that part of the country and I had been in those buildings. It was horrific to see on television. I cannot imagine what it was like there. My main fear was whether I knew anyone in those buildings, relatives or friends, and the phone lines were down. Took hours to hear from people. That waiting was probably the worst part. My mother, brother, and I had to coordinate everything. I had to work that day and the roads were strangely quiet. There were no planes in the air. When I arrived, I was sent home because they closed for the day and did not notify everyone. The drive home felt surreal. Story 46. I was 17 and in Australia. After breakfast, I turned on the news and was shocked. It was between the two towers being hit. I called my parents to tell them something was on television they should see. My mother was annoyed and thought I was exaggerating until she saw it for herself. Story 47. We learned that someone in our family whom we loved deeply had just died. Story 48. I remember hiking up Pyramid Mountain with my grandfather and seeing smoke rising from the skyline. We sat there in silence for a long time watching. I was 9 and did not fully understand what had happened. Story 49. For me, it was not knowing what was happening. I was in 7th grade in New York, about an hour north of New York City. Despite having televisions in every classroom, the teachers were instructed not to put on the news or even discuss what was happening. During the day, teachers were crying, and students were being called out of class and picked up by their parents. By the last period, I was one of 10 students left in an English class that would normally have 30. Story 50. The second tower was hit. Many people watched it live, and that is when we knew for sure this was an attack. When the towers fell, we heard people were choosing to jump rather than burn alive. Also, when we would not take care of our heroes who later developed cancer. The ugly truth is we never recovered from that. This used to be a country to be proud of, but now we face a fork in the road. I hope we make the right choice, but supporters of Make America Great Again must be held accountable first. Story 51. In my opinion, the long delay before our so-called leaders went on the air to explain what had happened made things worse. Instead, We watched hours of the tragedy replayed on the news and saw first responders searching for survivors in the wreckage. Those responders were later denied health care for trying to do the right thing, courtesy of the same party that failed us that day and continues to fail us. Story 52. Not mine, but my best friend was in labor, watching the horror unfold. She gave birth that afternoon, terrified about the world she had brought her child into. Story 53. I watched people who had families, loved ones, and friends choose to jump from a 76-story window because it was better than burning alive. Story 54. I was in 3rd grade when it happened, so I do not remember much. What I do remember is that our teacher received a call. He told us to sit at our desks because something important was happening. He turned on the news. I did not understand what was happening or its gravity. During the broadcast, phones began to ring as parents called to say they were coming to get their children, including my mother. Classes were canceled. After my mother picked me up, she explained how the world works, what a terrorist is, and what had happened. My mother lived about 150 miles away at the time, and I lived with my father. I knew it was serious because she was driving that far. She had been working at McDonald's and stopped in on her day off, and one of her coworkers thought it might be a hoax. It definitely was not. Story 55. Loss of innocence. I was 18. That day changed everything. It took me 7 years to agree to go to the city again. I was heading to work in downtown Manhattan, scheduled to be there by 10 a.m. The first plane hit. I called my job and they told me to come in anyway. My mother begged me not to go, but I was determined. Then the second plane hit. You have to remember that the Twin Towers had been bombed a couple of years prior. I believe it was the parking garage. As this event unfolded, the gravity sank in. It was not just New York under attack. The worst image was someone jumping to their death from the building on live television. In real life, smoke billowed into the sky. You could see it from Queens. It was unimaginable. This could not be real. Life had really just begun, and our nation was under attack. I went to work the next day even though all streets below 4th Street were supposed to be closed. There was a reason for the closure. The subway skipped the Chambers Street station, but you could see debris and clothing scattered on the ground. I should never have gone in that day. The debris, the smell, emergency crews from different states, handmade memorials posted on walls, and candles. The heaviness hung in the air. It was so sad. I never went back to my job after September 12th. Story 56. The second one hit while I was heading to participate in a base exercise, and it turned into real-world accountability so we could prepare to deploy. Story 57. This may sound callous, but as a teenage kid living nowhere near it, this was the worst part. They broadcast constant, live news coverage on every channel all day, even on music television and Nickelodeon. There was no escaping it. It was abundantly clear that this had changed the game forever. Story 58. I had to walk through blood and bones in the streets of Manhattan while trying to find my brother. Story 59. I was 10. I had just come in from school. My mother called me into the living room to see what was happening. About 30 seconds after I started watching the news, the second plane hit. That was the day I truly realized the world is not the happy place I thought it was, and that not everyone was as lucky as I was. Story 60. I was 6 and lived in Australia. I remember being confused because the morning cartoons weren't playing, the adults were panicked, and nobody explained what was happening. Story 61. I did not know exactly what was happening throughout the day. Story 62. I was very young, in 3rd grade. Parents were slowly picking up their children, not knowing what was happening. We stayed in class the whole day. We even ate lunch in class. Story 63. I watched our Port Authority police return to headquarters, covered in dust and with the 1,000-yard stare. I was called all day and asked if I had heard from people who never returned. I watched One World Trade Center fall from across the river. The following day at work, everyone's eyes were red from lack of sleep and tears. Story 64. Stand up. Close your eyes. Picture a beautiful cloudless blue sky on a sunny morning. Imagine you are at the window of one of the tallest buildings in the world, overlooking a bustling city. Now imagine you are on the ledge, clinging to the side for dear life while trying to stay away from the suffocating smoke and unbearable heat that are closing in from inside. Imagine making the decision to jump. Story 65. I lived in New York City. When I was 12 years old, I saw teachers, students, and faculty running out of the school toward the office, sobbing and hoping their family members were still alive. Story 66. It was not the first building hit. That could have been attributed to an accident, but I knew something was wrong. How many years up to that point had New York operated with two major airports without anything like this ever happening? When the second tower was hit, I knew the day had become life-altering. It was no accident. Neither the first nor the second tower was an accident. September 11th, 2001 was the second day of my last year of college. I woke up that morning to get ready for class, but I did not go. The world changed in that moment, and it was never the same again. I was in Boston, so we felt the effects not only because of our proximity to New York, but because one of the flights had departed from Logan. I felt miserable as the news unfolded through the day. I am glad I had 22 years of life before September 11th, 2001 to experience the world as it was. I remember that life, and I miss it. Whatever has happened since then, especially since 2017, feels awful. Story 67. I knew things would never be the same again. That was the day the optimism of the 90s died. Story 68. That split second of realizing that the tower was actually collapsing, that everyone inside and on the ground was dying, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Story 69. I did not know what was going to happen next. My apartment was several blocks away from the towers, but I could see everything that was going on. I stayed in my apartment for 3 days, watching trucks carry smoldering ash and debris, watching people post signs for lost loved ones, and hearing police cars, fire trucks, and ambulance sirens at all hours. Floodlights at night lit up my dark room, and all I could do was look out the window, grateful that I was alive but uncertain of what was to come. Story 70. Maybe not the worst, but pretty fucking scary. I lived in Anchorage, Alaska, and was watching the horror being repeated on television when the national broadcast cut away to local coverage. A Korean jet had a hijack code activated because of a translation issue, and reporters said downtown Anchorage was being evacuated. A jet from Royal Dutch Airlines was escorted by military aircraft to Canada. On a day with world-changing events, Anchorage suddenly had its own scary incident. Story 71. Seeing my friend's name on the list for one of the Boston to Los Angeles flights. Story 72. I am in agreement with the other statements. It was the moment we realized the United States of America was physically under attack and the plane crash was not an accident. As someone who had just turned 18 less than 2 months before it happened, I was filled with anxiety about being drafted and going to war. In the following months, the entire country was on edge, bracing for another attack that thankfully never came. Anthrax and other biochemical scares were frequent. Story 73. I worried about a man I had never met to whom I had mailed an eBay package on Saturday the 8th. He was fine and the package never made it to the tower. He picked it up at an off-site location a few blocks away. Story 74. 1. The second impact on the World Trade Center. 2. The realization that United Flight 93 flew over our heads in western Pennsylvania, which added a deeper sense of connection to the tragedy. Story 75. When the second plane struck the Pentagon, it became clear that this was intentional and organized. What would come next? Story 76. For me, it was that they canceled Digimon and, in fact, all of Cheese Television to show news footage. I was too young and too far away to really understand or care. It felt like, wow, something crazy had happened in the United States of America. As an adult, I now have a more thorough understanding and some empathy, but I was about 9 years old. Story 77. I thought one of the towers would remain standing. Story 78. When the Pentagon was hit, I realized I did not know how long this would go on. It was not just New York City. They had hit the headquarters of the strongest military in the world. Then a plane went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. How many more planes? Where were they going to hit next? My mind raced, imagining sites and cities in the United States that might be struck. The Hoover Dam? What might happen to Chicago or San Francisco? News could have flashed across the screen that an atomic bomb had been detonated in Los Angeles, and I would not have been surprised. I was stunned but not surprised. We know September 11th was an attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, along with the brave tragedy of Flight 93. But on September 11th, the worst moment was not knowing when it would end. Story 79. When the second plane hit, a part of me is still affected by it. Story 80. I worked in Pittsburgh for the federal government as an information technology person supporting federal officers. An officer had a friend who worked in the control tower at Pittsburgh International Airport. The officer called and was told that after the two crashes in New York City, they had lost contact with a plane near Cleveland and it had turned toward Pittsburgh. It took a long time for supervisors and judges to decide to close the building. Once they finally did, we left and sat in traffic for hours to get out of the city. Nobody knew what the targets were. The tallest building in Pittsburgh is the United States Steel Building, next to the federal courthouse. The entire street would have been destroyed if the plane had hit it. Flight 93 went down in a field about an hour east of Pittsburgh instead. Story 81. Not knowing for the rest of the day whether anything else would fall from the sky, everyone realized it was an attack after the second plane. Story 82. I was 6. I remember saying something was cool, and my parents getting angry. I definitely didn't understand the gravity of the situation. They rushed us out of school without really telling us anything. The next day, our teacher said that people far away had done something terrible. Children asked her questions. She began to cry and asked the teacher's aide to take over for a minute because she had to step out. Story 83. Watching the second plane live, I realized it was deliberate, not an accident. Story 84. I was 11 years old, watching objects fall from the building. I remember asking my mother why people were throwing books out of the windows. She told me they were people jumping. The horror of that realization was the worst moment of the day for me. Story 85. I remember about 3 things from that day. I was a freshman in high school. I remember being in English class when the teacher told us. Then we turned on the television to watch and saw the second plane hit the building. We went home early. It was a very somber ride on the school bus. About 15 minutes after I got home, we received a phone call informing us that one of my cousins had committed suicide 15 minutes before the first plane hit. It was probably one of the most tragic days of my life. Story 86. You realized that you were watching thousands of people die at once on live television. Story 87. When the second plane hit, everyone knew it was not an accident. Story 88. To be honest, it was the self-absorbed actions of my husband. He was working at a job site in a city that was much more exciting than our own little town. I just wanted him home with me and our children, who were 7 and 11. I was scared. He concluded that the people at the job site needed him more than we did and booked a hotel instead of driving the 90 minutes home. He preferred to hang out in a hotel room or a bar, chatting and feeling important, rather than come home to comfort his family, which he found boring. Story 89. Watching a shady New York businessman extol how his building was now the tallest in Manhattan on live TV. Story 90. I was in 5th grade. The teachers were gathered in the hallway, crying. They were trying to keep it together for the students. We did not learn any school material that day, but I will never forget the look of fear and grief on my teachers' faces. Story 91. I first heard about the second plane while boarding a flight at Heathrow to Logan. Someone in line behind me mentioned that the first plane had hit a building. We all assumed it was a small private plane that had accidentally struck it. As we were taking our seats, we were told we would be delayed because of an accident in New York that had created a major disruption to air traffic. Shortly after, the pilot announced the second plane. That is when we realized it was not an accident and it was not a small plane. This was going to be a life-changing event on the scale of Pearl Harbor. We were stuck on the plane at the gate for hours until we were allowed to disembark. It was frustrating to receive only bits of information from the pilot and to hear rumors spread around the cabin from the few people with working cell phone service. We had little idea what was happening and were just waiting for the next piece of bad news. Story 92. Your title makes it seem like this was 50 years ago, not about 20 years ago. It was the confusion and uncertainty, not knowing who was responsible, what would happen next, or how our lives would change. The patriotism that followed and the unity of the nation were some of the greatest moments I remember as an American. It is sad where we are now and the toxicity that permeates everywhere. Story 93. I was in history class. My teacher told us we were watching history in real time and that this was going to change our lives. He looked crazy, and I thought he was, but 25 years later I realized he was right. The terrorists won. Not that day, but in the years since we have lost men and women to war, killed countless people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, given our government the power to strip us of our rights in the name of safety, spiraled into debt fighting unwinnable wars that enriched the corrupt, and reinforced the ideology of those who attacked us in the name of justice. It is a goddamn shame. Story 94. I realized that the small dots falling from the upper floors weren't just debris. I was only 8 when it happened, but I'll never forget the heart-wrenching shock when I noticed those small specks on the camera feed were shaped like people. That feeling of pure, sickening horror is still seared into my memory 24 years later. After the second plane struck the second tower, the illusion that the United States was untouchable was shattered. We were no longer just fighting insurgents on the other side of the planet. They hit us on our own soil, which meant everyone was now a target for extremists, regardless of age or origin. It completely changed my perception of safety in our own country. Story 95. I grew up in a small town and joined a program in high school where I could train with my fire department. The fire service is a family. It is really like no other job. You are with your crew more than your own family. When every television in my school had the news on, I could hear in the background the firefighters' pass alarms, the personal alert safety system, basically an alarm that ensures you move every so often or it goes off indicating you are not moving. I could hear so many of them. I knew the number of firefighters we had lost was terrible. I had to walk out of the school and go to a small stand of trees where I sat bawling. My principal, who knew I was in the program, came out and sat with me. Story 96. Watching the first World Trade Center tower actually fall and then having to deal with Generation Z and Generation Alpha treating the September 11th attacks as memes 24 years later. Story 97. Show and Tell was canceled. I was 7 years old. I was not old enough to understand what was happening or why it mattered. All I knew was that I would not be able to show the class my Pokemon cards. Update. Does this community expect me to invent something to virtue signal? I did not understand the concept of death or that we were witnessing a tragedy. In my underdeveloped mind, the only thing I understood was that I could no longer do something I had been excited about. Not all of us are born with a fully developed adult brain. Story 98. The realization that terrorists had attacked us on our own land was overwhelming. The whole country shut down that day. It was completely surreal. Story 99. For me, the moment the second plane struck changed everything. After the first plane, I thought it was an accident. I remember watching the burning towers. The last thing I expected was another plane. Surreal. Story 100. I tried to reach my friend in Boston, who often flew to New York, but all the phones were jammed. Story 101. I was 10 years old. My dad sat staring at the bunny ear television he had brought up from the basement, watching it over and over in shock. We were sent home early from school. No one told us why, but we all knew it was something scary. Story 102. There was a realization that the first crash was not an accident, and tension mounted as people waited for news from across the country. Once the crash in Shanksville occurred and all planes were grounded, the death toll was staggering. Story 103. Being told to get ready for school on the second day of freshman year of high school. Story 104. Realizing a second plane confirmed the first collision was not an accident. Story 105. Driving to work, I legitimately thought it was a War of the Worlds radio prank until I realized it was on every station. Story 106. Watching the second plane hit and people jump to their deaths. Story 107. When the second plane hit, I thought, the United States will start a war against some Muslim country as revenge. I am still amazed that Saudi Arabia managed to evacuate plane loads of Saudi royalty and spies while most air traffic was grounded. Then the Saudis deflected responsibility when it became known that many of the hijackers were Saudi nationals, like Osama bin Laden. So the United States attacked Afghanistan, not Saudi Arabia. Story 108. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is still fucking alive in Guantanamo, if he is really there, and they did not have a public execution for the scumbag in New York. May he and everyone who helped him rot. Story 109. The smell was terrible. It hit me that it was our city, and I did not know whether the people I knew there were alive or dead. Story 110. Everything about that day was the worst, and having to get up and go to work that night as though nothing had happened was also awful. Story 111. I came home that afternoon and found my son watching the coverage on television. I could see its effect on him. The event affected not only adults but also children. We had a long talk about it. Story 112. A memory that is not a bad moment, just a strange one. At the time I worked at a call center providing technical support for Gateway computers. I worked the evening shift, from 2 in the afternoon to 8 in the evening. I called around noon to ask if we were still working. The answer was yes. As expected, the shift was dead. Normally you stayed pretty busy with calls, but that night I went hours without the phone ringing. It made sense because everyone was watching television news channels. Everything was quiet until about 6:30 in the evening, when I got a call from someone reporting a broken key on their keyboard. That has stuck with me for almost 25 years. On the day of an epical event, the greatest tragedy on American soil since at least 1941, one person was concerned that the tilde key was sticking. Story 113. Realizing that much of the debris falling consisted of people jumping. Story 114. This may come across as insensitive, but I was 8 years old. I clearly remember that Cheese Television, an Australian children's cartoon program that aired in the mornings before school, was cancelled so they could broadcast live footage of the Twin Towers collapsing. I had no idea what it truly meant at the time. All I knew was I was missing Dragon Ball Z, and I was not happy. Story 115. Hearing that people jumped from the top floors to avoid being burned to death still hurts. Story 116. 1. Having no idea how many planes there were, or if there were also bombs on bridges, buildings, or elsewhere waiting to go off. 2. I lived in New Jersey in an area where people commuted to New York City for work. You could not make a phone call. All circuits are busy, was the recording I remember hearing when trying to call my mom. 3. Every channel except Cartoon Network had either news coverage or a message saying, "Due to today's events, we have suspended our programming." 4. To those too young to remember September 11th, 2001, I do not think you can fully grasp what it was like not to know how many planes or bombs were coming, while lacking social media and reliable cell phone contact with people in New York City and Washington, D.C. Writing this brings tears to my eyes. I was a teenager then and am now almost 40. The fear and darkness I felt that day is unparalleled. Story 117. The beginning of the lies and the end of democracy. Story 118. I think it really depends on where you lived and how old you were. I'm from Central Europe and I was 12 and at school when it happened. It was in the early afternoon, and our teacher mentioned that something had happened in the United States and asked if we wanted to watch the news in the television room. We said yes because honestly anything was better than math. They talked about some tall buildings being hit by planes, but we had never even heard of the Twin Towers before, so it did not feel very significant to us at the time. We were just kids with no real understanding of the United States or what those buildings meant. To us, it was just two random skyscrapers full of smoke. I remember that most of us did not pay much attention to the news. We mostly used the time to chat about our weekend plans and favorite television shows, while our teacher was completely glued to the screen. Story 119. Watching people jump from the building felt like a form of hope. I was 9 years old when September 11th happened. I was watching television with my family and I asked my older sister why people were jumping from the building. Wouldn't they rather try to see if they could make it downstairs? She said she thought they already knew they would not make it down. The stairs were probably blocked. She thought they were faced with two choices: to jump and end it there, knowing they had a choice, or to try to stay alive even though there was no escape and risk being burned alive. Story 120. When the first plane crashed, we were high school students and thought it was a crazy accident. When the second plane crashed, there was an immediate shift to the belief that it was an attack. The other big thing I remember from that day was the halt in air traffic. You do not realize how much background noise planes provide until it is completely gone. I felt something similar the day after the city shut down because of the coronavirus disease 2019. Story 121. I watched the truth on live television and was then lied to about what I saw. Story 122. I waited to hear about some miraculous discovery of a pocket of survivors, but that never happened. Story 123. I realized when I had spoken to the Marine recruiter 5 days earlier that war is real and I could die serving my country. By the grace of God, I made it home. Semper Fidelis. Story 124. I remember seeing how scared everyone was. It stuck with me all these years. I also remember how everyone came together for a brief time. Story 125. New Jersey. As I said, we realized it was not an accident. I remember scanning the sky as I went to pick my children up from school. Once I had them settled watching the public broadcasting service, I snuck upstairs and turned on the news. I literally dropped to my knees at the images. The sky was so perfectly blue. Story 126. The people jumping really got me. There is a picture of a black man wearing a tie that still haunts me. Story 127. I was working in the National Canadian Broadcasting Corporation television newsroom, downloading raw feeds before they were edited for human consumption. So many people jumped. The sound was horrific. Story 128. The raw footage just kept getting worse. Footage of the planes was bad enough. As the day went on, there was footage of people running and screaming and of people falling from the buildings. I was 17, and the classroom televisions had the news playing all day because we did not have streaming. All television channels were covering it. Story 129. I watched my elderly neighbor wander out of the house in his pajamas looking for help. He had early-stage Alzheimer's disease, and when he saw the crash on television, he believed his wife was on that plane. Story 130. My college roommate worked in one of the towers. I spent the entire day wondering whether he had died while I was watching in real time, helpless to do anything about it. Story 131. When the second plane hit, we realized it was no accident. Story 132. I cried every day for a year after September 11, 2001. My neighbor knew one of the flight attendants. My boss was almost killed at the Pentagon by a plane flown by his next-door neighbor. An Army analyst was listed as killed twice. He had been scheduled to present a paper at a conference in San Francisco. He was reported to be a passenger on a plane that crashed, and his office at the Pentagon was also struck, killing him and his colleagues. He would have died whether he went to work or boarded that plane. The human tragedy was unlike anything I thought I would ever witness as a young man living in the District of Columbia. I am crying now. It was almost 25 years ago. Story 133. We had no idea how many people were still trapped above those impact points when the towers collapsed. There could easily have been between 10,000 and 15,000 deaths. Story 134. The moment the second plane hit, you knew it was not an accident. Story 135. I knew the world was going to be much worse afterward and that the powers that be would make bad decisions in response. I was 15, a sophomore, and I watched it live on a television in a common area at my school. When the second plane hit, it was clear our country would never be the same. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.